provide context and acknowledgements for today's program, as well as introduce our speaker. So context. In May 2017, the Town of Hanover voted to adopt what we now call our Ready for 100 goals, having the entire town use 100% renewable sources for electricity by 2030, followed by transportation, heating, and cooling by 2050. Soon after, Sustainable Hanover launched an initiative to lead, support, and engage the community in achieving these goals. And we are making good progress on the first, electricity. The town has walked the talk. Solar panels installed on town properties now offset nearly all the electricity needed for municipal operations. Also, town-wide solar capacity has grown to just over 6 megawatts. This includes systems for 318, or 10% of our households, the town's 8 installations, and Dartmouth's 17. Next, and transformational, nearly all small customers now have access to renewable electricity through Hanover Community Power, launched just last May. Hanover leads all towns that have thus far launched in the renewable content of its power. And while we lead, the fact is we need all customers, you and me, to opt up. This is one of the least costly and easiest ways to help. It involves going to a website, providing your utilities account number, and selecting the Clean 100 option. And we are happy to assist you. Finally, the Community Power Coalition of New Hampshire has begun to explore community power for medium and large users so that they too can access 100% renewable electricity. That's goal number 1. Goal number 2, we are also making progress with transportation. One available metric is the number of registered EVs. In 2023, there were 324, which doesn't sound like much, but that's a 40% increase over 2022 and about 5% of the cars in town. Our third goal, renewably sourced heating and cooling, brings us here today. For a very long time, there has been a tall smokestack attached to a plant in downtown Hanover using number 6 fuel oil to heat Dartmouth College. I'm sure we can all agree that while it has served us well, its retirement is overdue. We are heartened by President Bylock's commitment in words and funding for the college to reach zero emissions by 2050. Plans to do so now include a new strategy for its district heating system, which you are soon to hear about. Before introducing our speaker, I want to thank Dartmouth for collaborating with us on this forum, and hello to everybody on Zoom, providing technical support, refreshments, and our speaker. We are particularly grateful to Grace Mendelia, class of 24, and Marcus Welker, Assistant Director of the Sustainability Office, and its representative to the Sustainable Hanover Committee. Thank you, Marcus. I also want to welcome Emma Wolf, Dartmouth's VP for Government and Community Relations. Emma's charge includes maximizing Dartmouth's connections with key officials in Hanover, Concord, and Washington, creating a strategic plan for community and town relations, and optimizing opportunities to enhance Dartmouth's profile. Thank you for being here, Emma, and if you'd like to say a few words, please do.
Thank you so much. I can just say hello from here, right?
Sure.
Hi, everybody. It's good to see some friendly faces, and it's so nice to be able to continue working with colleagues at Dartmouth who are just doing such impressive work. And Sustainable Hanover, you all have been so friendly from the beginning, but also I'm very excited. It's an inaugural office. The work that you're doing locally, you don't need my help whatsoever in terms of government relations, but I'm here to help as much as humanly possible if you ever do. And certainly my team as well. And I do have to say, the amazing things that you're doing, I think, are also going to have an impact well beyond the borders of Hanover and the Upper Valley. So insofar as you make your progress, we're going to want to show your good work off at the federal level too. So it's great to be here, and thank you so much.
Thanks for being here, Emma. So finally, our speaker. Rosi Kerr has been the Director of Sustainability at Dartmouth for 13 years. She aims to help transform Dartmouth into a global leader of sustainability scholarship, education, and action. She brings experience in community-based energy systems, energy markets, environmental nonprofits, and organizational change. Rosi is going to speak on Dartmouth's energy future. Turns out, Rosi spoke on this same topic in this same room nearly 10 years ago.
Oh,
Wow.
At that time, Liberty had plans to build a depot and distribution system for liquefied natural gas, or LNG, and was counting on Dartmouth to be its largest customer. One of 4 speakers, Rosi outlined options for Dartmouth's energy future, one of which was LNG. After that educational forum, Dartmouth veered away from LNG, aiding to its demise locally. 5 years later, the college presented an energy plan to the community involving biomass. Faced with resistance, the college backed off. Now it returns with a new plan, one that is potentially greenhouse gas free. I, for one, am grateful to Dartmouth and to Rosi for being able to listen, to go back to the drawing board, and strive to make things better. Rosi will speak for 30 minutes and then answer questions. Rosi.
Thanks so much to Judy and to Sustainable Hanover. I think we owe a great debt of gratitude at Dartmouth, and I personally owe a great debt of gratitude to the Town of Hanover for its leadership and this sort of consistent, dogged desire to hold Dartmouth and myself to high account, which I appreciate very much. I think it's part of what makes it really fun to work here and part of the challenge. So I'm going to share some of the story that Judy shared in a little bit more detail. This conversation can evolve if there's folks on the phone or on Zoom who have questions. Marcus will grab those. Feel free to interrupt me if you like, and we can also do questions at the end. See if I can advance. Yes, I can. So I'm going to kind of try to hit all levels because I assume that some of you have a lot of experience with Dartmouth's energy system and maybe some of you less so. But one of the reasons that I love working at Dartmouth on sustainability is that Dartmouth itself and Hanover are a microcosm of anywhere. Dartmouth has a metabolism sitting here in the Upper Valley. Every day we kind of inhale resources and every day we exhaust waste across all of our operational categories, right? Literal and figurative. So every day trucks arrive at the back of our dining hall full of chicken nuggets, and every day students flush toilets and wastes go to the sewage treatment plant. Every day we consume fossil fuel and exhaust CO2 into the atmosphere. And that metabolism is the same as, a smaller version of Calcutta or Bloomington, Indiana, or Seattle. And a scale that I really love working on, in part because of the context we find ourselves in. I love this place, and I love that Dartmouth is deeply and inextricably rooted into this place. So this is kind of how we sit right here in the Upper Valley. I've drawn these lines as solid, but they're not. They're highly permeable, right? One of the metabolisms of Dartmouth is the flow of humans every day onto our campus and off of our campus, many of whom live in Hanover, or in my case, in Stratford, Vermont, or Cornish, or Corinth, or wherever. And every day all those people arrive, and every day they go home. Literal physical things are carried onto campus as well. You get takeout and you walk it onto campus and you throw away your container on campus. So we're inextricably connected to our place, the Upper Valley, and also to the world. We're part of a global economy. Dartmouth receives 180,000 packages to the HPs every year. So to the students. That's not the stuff being delivered to the back end. I don't think I need to tell this group, but just in case, the urgency of climate change is very real. It's very apparent. And one of the things that I've appreciated over the last 13 years is, presumably because we're a research and teaching institution, and development of knowledge is core to our mission, we have been staying appraised of what is happening in the science of climate change. And the short story is, it is getting more and more urgent that we act now. Every new IPCC report tells us that we need to act now. They make really cool things that look like this, that essentially my takeaway from this is 2 roads diverged in a Dartmouth wood, and you've got to pick a path. And you've got to do that immediately. The need for immediate action is going to determine where we end up, and the difference between here and there is a big difference. Doesn't seem like a lot when you're at the diversion point, right? So just in case anyone needed convincing, climate change is here. The immediacy of our action is critically important, and that was a big part of why we pivoted away from biomass. We're thinking about our work at Dartmouth on sustainability in 4 legs of a chair. One of those is teaching, one of those is research. Obviously, those are core to Dartmouth's mission and our identity and what we do, our core business. Another is experiential learning, or campus as lab, and operations. Those are kind of our office's area, right? Campus as lab, we have students who are dying to get their hands dirty. One of the reasons I came back to work at Dartmouth is a student takes a class, they take an environmental studies 2 class or an engines 2 class with Jack or something, and they get fired up about climate change or a sustainability challenge, and they want to do something actual. So they show up in our office, fired up about an idea, and we help them give solving it a shot. Everything in our office, actually including our office itself, including my position, came out of a student who adamantly refused to stop saying they wanted to change a thing. The office came out of students going to the president's office in 2005 and 6 and saying, we need a sustainability office at Dartmouth. Projects like getting rid of those single-use plastic clamshells. Do you remember how there used to be trash cans overflowing on the green with single-use plastic clamshells? A student walked into our office and said, I want to get rid of plastic clamshells at Dartmouth. They spent 2 years identifying the problem, figuring out why people like to use plastic clamshells, and developed the Green to Go program, which is now how it's done on Dartmouth's campus with reusable plastic clamshells. So all across scales, everything we do has come out of a student passion. And our thought is that's part of what makes doing this work on a college campus a unique opportunity. If our product is our students have a huge and disproportionate impact on climate change in the world, partly because they disproportionately consume resources globally, partly because they will disproportionately make decisions. They'll disproportionately be governors or senators or CEOs of companies or heads of Sustainable Hanover or whatever. And they are going to disproportionately impact how the climate change story goes. So by giving them real world opportunities here, we hope to bend the arc of their trajectory. The other part of what I work on is operations, trying to make that metabolism of Dartmouth more sustainable over time, right? Obviously, we have a lot of built infrastructure. You can't snap your fingers and immediately change everything. But the idea is to change our infrastructure to become more sustainable over time. Right now, Laura Ogden is working on identifying what is Dartmouth's opportunity in teaching and research, and what does that connection in the middle look like? She and I are collaborating on how do we make that super awesome? What is Dartmouth's contribution to the sustainability and climate change conversation here, nationally, and globally? My favorite part of what we do is these guys. We have 20 to 40 students working in our office. Grace is a good example at any one time. These are interns. We hire students to work in our office so that every student, regardless of their socioeconomic background, can work on sustainability while they're here. They have the option to do it. We take students out into the field in places like West Virginia. Right now we have 2 immersive learning experiences happening, one in West Virginia and one in our sugar crew out at the sugar shack on the organic farm. And they, in West Virginia, for example, are learning about the legacy impacts of fossil fuel extraction in the field, talking to real people, literally immersing themselves in acid mine drainage and experiencing what that ecosystem is like. We also oversee the Dartmouth Organic Farm, another thing that came out of a student idea, a member of my class who dug up an ENVS 50 report from the 80s and decided they wanted to start the organic farm. And we oversee things like Dartmouth Bikes, which is a big part of what Marcus does, which addressing the fact that there's no bike shop in the town of Hanover, we have started a program to try to avoid sending waste to landfill, sending bikes to landfill, which happens because students can't maintain them. They leave them on a rack. The bike rots. I just want to pause for a second. I'm talking fast. Am I talking too fast? No? Am I being loud enough?
Yes.
Did everybody hear me? Okay, on Zoom, are we good? Everybody on Zoom good?
No concerns voiced yet.
Awesome. Cool. So what is climate action at Dartmouth? It takes a lot of different forms. I talked about immersion trips. This is from the Gulf Coast, the organic farm. It's getting out. We have a test well being drilled right now. This is an example of a test well that we drilled on the green, trying to understand the green as an energy resource. It's being involved in classes. It's activism, like the Divest movement, or students who are involved in Sunrise Dartmouth or the New Green Deal, Green New Deal. It's getting involved in our strategic planning efforts. It takes lots of different shapes. So I want to dive in a little bit to talk. I talked about experiential learning. Now we're going to talk about operations. So what is Dartmouth going to do if we're not going to use LNG, if we're not going to use biomass? What is it we are going to do? A little trip down memory lane. So when I arrived at Dartmouth in 2010, then President Wright had set greenhouse gas emissions targets in 2008. That's this yellow line on here. Can you guys see that yellow line?
Yeah, vaguely.
Vaguely. It was kind of a vaguely goal, so that's appropriate. This is a goal that I would call tepid. No offense to President Wright, but it was an early, not very audacious sustainability goal. This green line was President Hamlin's goal, was based on the G7. You'll note that the greenhouse gas emissions here are not zero. So it was an 80% reduction by 2050, 50% reduction by 2025. I told you that the science is saying we have to act urgently, we have to act now, and we have to act more boldly. So we need to do better than this, right? Our current progress is notable in sort of step with Town of Hanover. We have reduced our greenhouse gas emissions 24% using efficiency, mostly. But we have to go a lot harder and faster to meet the urgent demands of climate change. People often ask how we're doing compared to our peers. So this is actually not what we're doing, this is what our goals are. This is Dartmouth, E, and this is our peers in the Ivy Plus Sustainability Consortium. All of these schools have pledged to get to 100% carbon reduction, carbon zero. The ones with TAN are using offsets to do so. And this is Dartmouth with an 80% reduction. So all of our peers are making bold commitments to climate. There's a lot of gray on here, which is unknown and other. People don't necessarily know how they're going to get to zero, but they're committing to go for it, essentially. So Judy mentioned that President Bylock, in her inauguration speech, said that climate and sustainability is going to be one of her critical imperatives, and that she's pushing Dartmouth to achieve real carbon zero. That is not to produce scope 1 and 2 emissions on our campus by 2050. That's a bold statement. We're in the process of preparing a set of goals between here and there. She's figuring out what are the goals going to be that I set between here and there. But now we've got to chart the course. Like, what does it look like to get from here to that place? Judy also mentioned what we currently do, but just in case people aren't aware of what we currently do, Dartmouth's current energy system involves number 6 fuel oil arriving in trucks, delivered to large tanks behind the Visual Arts Center. That number 6 fuel oil is burned in a central heating plant where it's used to produce steam and electricity, which go out to campus to provide heating and a portion of our electrical load. It's been like that for a pretty long time. Part of what makes Dartmouth, this is a technical graph, but it's part of what makes Dartmouth difficult to decarbonize. Because the only takeaway that I want you to get from this is, this looks peaky, and it is. Dartmouth's heating demand is our big energy drain, right? That's our big demand. We need to stay warm and conditioned when it's -20 out, or when it's -20 one day and 43 the next and 0 the next. And that takes an enormous amount of energy. I today was reading a case study from Caltech, and my takeaway on Caltech's decarbonization was like, well, it's easy for you to say because it's like warm all the time. Right now, they do have a lot of cooling demand at Caltech, but it's difficult to decarbonize when you're in a rural place and when you have a really peaky energy system that requires, you can't not heat on that coldest day in February, right? We also have resiliency challenges that you don't have in your home. Something that happens a lot is people say like, why don't you just use air source heat pumps like I use in my house? Or why don't you just do what I did in my house? Well, at my house, the plan is to fire up the wood stove if all else fails, right? I have a backup to the backup, which is the wood stove. Dartmouth can't do that, right? We can't do that on this scale. And we have things like many, many millions of dollars of research stored in -80 freezers that cannot have a supply interruption because the researcher has spent tens of millions of dollars and many units of carbon pulling ice cores out of Antarctica, and we can't let those melt. So we have to have resiliency that you don't have to have at home. Also, it's frowned upon to freeze students in their rooms, right? So I said we've been doing this for a long time. I like to tell students that if you had come to Dartmouth in the late 1800s or early 1900s, you might have come here because of our amazing back pressure turbines, right? This really amazing technology. It was Tesla's technology, right? And so the men of Dartmouth would come and polish the turbines in between classes. At least I like to think so. I don't know if they actually did that, but they're doing something like that. Yes. Maybe they're just posing. So this is what we do now, and I think this is like 2020 data, but it's more or less the same. If you take all of our energy and you put it in one pie chart of MMBTUs, this is what it looks like, right? So mostly we're getting our energy from number 6 fuel oil. Some of it we're buying in the form of electricity, some of it we're generating on our rooftops. More and more solar arrays all the time on Dartmouth's rooftops, but it is still a small percentage. So this also needs to be updated, but the trend has continued. The most important thing we can do is become more efficient. Obviously, we want to avoid needing energy as much as we possibly can. It's much less expensive to not need the energy, right? Makes things much more comfortable to not need the energy. So what this shows is that Dartmouth has grown in square footage since 2000, pretty steadily. Dartmouth's energy use has declined. We are continuing to decrease our energy use and our energy use intensity, the amount of energy we use per square foot. And this is a critical trajectory. At no point are we lightening the focus on this. Stuff that was low-hanging fruit we got to first. The stuff that was high-hanging fruit when we started working on energy efficiency is now low-hanging fruit, and we're working on that. And Abby Bjorklund, who has a constant stream of projects that are going through energy efficiency upgrades. So that's critical. Energy efficiency upgrades are not very sexy, right? It's one of the reasons that energy efficiency is kind of overlooked sometimes, but it's critically important. Changing valves, replacing steam traps, adding insulation, having really great building envelopes. When I first started, we just finished the Life Sciences Center, and the Life Sciences Center is a very energy efficient building. And as a lab building is pretty amazing, especially at the time when it opened. And the thing that makes it so amazing is its walls, right? But it's really hard to be like, this is the best walled building because they don't look that different, right? They're only different if you're Abby or Frank or Jack or someone who like dorks out on walls, right? Like me. But it makes a huge difference. So replacing old inefficient buildings like the Gilman Life Sciences Center with the Gilman Sciences Center, was that what it was called? Gilman. I took bio in that building. With the Life Sciences Center, which is radically more efficient, makes a big difference. But again, the things that make it so efficient are things you can't see, like building envelope or making sure that we don't have permeations in that envelope. So when I started at Dartmouth, this is how we were thinking. We were thinking, what can we do to replace this with something better, right? We're kind of going through a list of options. Well, we're not on a natural gas pipeline like most of our peers. We don't have a giant landfill nearby where we can pump landfill gas out of it. Our landfill is small relative to the kind of landfill we would need to run on landfill gas. So this is how we were thinking. This is a complicated picture, but just hold worrying about the picture for a second. We went with the Town of Hanover and Sustainable Hanover to Denmark on a learning experience. And I think that learning experience was actually a critical turning point in our thinking. When we went to Denmark, we went to Denmark because Denmark has district heating and cooling. The whole country, 97 or something % of Danish buildings are hooked onto district heating and cooling. So unlike my house, which has a #2 boiler in the basement, no house in Denmark has that. They have a hot water pipe, right? We went there because that's what Dartmouth has, and we wanted to learn how are they decarbonizing, which is a high priority in Denmark. 100% of Danish politicians believe that climate change is real, caused by humans, and they have to decarbonize, right? So they're arguing over how. So Denmark has made this transition from burning fossil fuel to do district heating and cooling using steam, or district heating using steam, to a low temperature hot water system that uses a variety of sources to make hot water and to make chilled water for air conditioning, which they're starting to need in Denmark, as we are starting to need it here. So this is Denmark's journey from low efficiency to high efficiency, from high temperature to low temperature, from single source in first generation to many sources in generation 4. Our opportunity was to say, well, we're kind of like over here-ish. How do we jump to over here, right? So Denmark was this fascinating learning opportunity for us to figure out how to go from first generation to fourth generation relatively quickly. It was also an opportunity for us to hang out together, which I thought was really cool for the town of Hanover and people that worked at Dartmouth to spend time together in biomass plants, out looking at wind turbines, listening to Danish entrepreneurs, kind of immersing ourselves in a district heating and cooling context. And I think part of why we decided to pivot away from biomass is starting to change our thinking from what I described, replacing oil with something better than oil, to a different approach, which is how do we diversify the pie? How do we shrink it? And how do we diversify the pie? That's a different approach than just how do we replace this with something better than that, right? So I think that shift was really born out of our collaboration with the town of Hanover and that trip. A brief word about organizational change. When people ask me what I do, when I'm, away and someone says, so what do you do for a living? I basically say, I work on organizational change. Because I think what we're trying to do here is to change a large, relatively conservative, slow-moving organization in a pretty radical and fundamental way, right? We've been doing adaptive change for a long time. I think we're now doing transformational change. What does it mean to kind of totally change the way we do things, to change how we think about sustainability as core to mission, for example? So just a little interlude about that. Step one in our transition to a more efficient, lower carbon energy system is to transition from inefficient steam, heating and cooling, melting snow on the green, to hot water. That's our critical first step. Variable temperature hot water. Some places it'll be as low as we can get it. Other places it's going to need to be a little bit higher. This transition is the enabling step that allows us to do everything else. Because in order to make steam, you need a high energy density fuel that you can burn to make steam. You can only add steam in one spot because it's a pressurized system. As soon as you're on hot water, you can use all kinds of different mechanisms to generate hot water. You can trap waste heat, which we currently exhaust. Like, for example, we have server banks at Dartmouth that generate heat. We air condition them in the winter, right? How could we capture that heat? We have a hockey rink, which is running in the wintertime, generating heat to make ice cold. Could we capture that heat? We have those -80 refrigerators, 200 of them. Could we capture that heat and dump it back into the system? But it's not going to be easy because we have 5.5 million square feet and a lot of it's currently running on steam. In order to make this transition, we have to rip the guts out of a lot of buildings to change them from from steam to hot water. We also have to rip up roads and lay down new pipe. We have to close down sections of road or cross sidewalks or do things like that. And it's a lot of pipe, right? Because it's got to connect the whole campus. So we're thinking about this in a district approach. One of our ideas is we don't want to disrupt everything all at the same time. This transition is going to take a little bit of time, but if we break the campus down and we think about completing each district so it can function before we move on to the next district, that also helps our trustees feel more comfortable because it's going to cost a lot of money. And that means that we're not going to have any stranded assets, right? We're going to finish one district, be able to then move on to the next one. But if we decide 3 districts in, I don't know, there's a financial collapse, we can't go on, we need to pause, the districts that we've built will operate. So that's kind of I think a really important way to think about this. It also allows us to confine the disruption to one area at a time and then leave that area alone once we're done. So then how are we going to make the hot water? Well, one way we can make it is using the sun, solar thermal. This is what they do in Denmark. They do it actually all over Europe in places you wouldn't think it would make sense, like Germany and Denmark, some Scandinavian countries. So you can actually use the sun instead of generating electricity like solar PV, you can use it just to heat water. We're also going to use geoexchange. Geoexchange is using the ground essentially as a large thermal battery. So if you think about it, like why did people have root cellars in Vermont? Well, because the ground is a stable temperature year round, right? So if you go down 6 feet, you get to about, 58 degrees, 60 degrees, something like that. And it stays that way all the way down to 800 feet. There's no lava under Hanover, unfortunately. I was in Jack's, I think it was in your class, Jack, and I asked the students, is there anyone in here who lives off grid or has a totally renewable house? And one student raised their hand. I was like, oh, interesting. That's never happened before. Where do you live? And she said, Iceland. And I was like, I don't want to talk to you anymore. Cheating. It's just like magma bubbling out of the ground. Really easy to make hot water in Iceland. But it is also cold and dark a lot of the time. And sometimes the volcanoes blow up. So here we're not talking about that. We're talking about geoexchange, just using the ground as a thermal battery. Pumping water in a closed pipe, so it doesn't interchange with the groundwater, down into the ground, getting it to 60 degrees or 58 degrees and bringing it back up. That's really good for base load heating and cooling, for that kind of ongoing heating and cooling demand that we have year round. That's what geoexchange is really good for. This is Notre Dame, who transitioned to geoexchange. Smith transitioned to geoexchange. Princeton transitioned to or is it underway transitioning to geoexchange? So this is a in-use technology in other places that are doing district heating and cooling. So one of the benefits, I guess one of the challenges of geoexchange is you have to put into the ground about the same amount of heat you're pulling out. So if you're pulling heat out of the ground in the wintertime to raise outside air to 60 degrees, 58 degrees, you have to be pumping heat down in the summertime. What that means is it provides actually an opportunity to add cooling. Because by adding cooling at Dartmouth, pulling heat out of buildings in the summer and pushing it into the ground, we're able to balance our geoexchange wells, and that will enable the wells to have a longer life. Life of a geoexchange well is about 20 years, and then they can start to lose their efficacy because they stop serving as such a good thermal battery. They can get worn out. So balancing the load, adding cooling, actually helps the life of the geoexchange well be longer. We're also going to use thermoses, giant thermoses. Not that look like this, but that do exactly the same thing. It would kind of be cool, I think, if we built them like this, like Dartmouth logo. Anyway, just an idea. Probably hard to permit in the town of Hanover. But I said we were interested in using solar thermal. If you're going to use solar thermal, you're going to generate that hot water in the summertime. But you need it in the wintertime for heating and cooling. It doesn't seem like it makes sense to store water seasonally, but water is actually pretty thermally stable, and it does make sense if you build super insulated tanks. These are Stanford's giant tanks. They're not shaped like Stanley thermoses, unfortunately, but they're giant tanks of water that they use to store heat and coolness. I guess it's all heat, but less heat and more heat, right? And then if we're going to do this transition, we're essentially transitioning from combustion to electricity to move heat around the campus. We're going from generating heat to moving heat. Does that make sense? If we're going to do this and we actually want to decarbonize, we have to figure out how to decarbonize our electric supply because we're going to need more electricity if we're going to do this. So solar PV on rooftops is something that we're doing all around Dartmouth's campus, but we can't put that much PV here on campus. So we are also thinking about how can we do power purchase agreements to buy renewable electricity in order to power our campus. It stabilizes our electricity rate. We can have more than one power purchase agreement, maybe different types of renewable electricity, some solar, some wind. We're thinking about being in our grid, so buying renewable electricity here where we're accountable, and decarbonizing our grid in that way. We're also really interested in being an offtake partner where Dartmouth is adding additional renewable energy to the grid. Does that make sense? Because if Dartmouth just, I don't know, buys renewable energy credits on the open market right now, we're not actually getting any new renewable energy built. But if Dartmouth partners with a renewable energy developer and builds a new renewable energy asset like a solar farm or 2 new wind turbines in an offshore project or something like that, we're actually adding demand and driving the grid towards renewables, which is important. So we're not only thinking about energy, I just wanted to bring that up. There's lots of intersections with Dartmouth's energy system and the other metabolic systems of our campus, right? Our energy system is going to use water, for example. It already does use water, lots of water from the Town of Hanover's water supply. There's intersections with our landscape. When we're digging up places, how are we thinking about putting them back together? Intersections with waste. Every time we think about pulling a building down, we have a waste problem on our hands. We're also thinking about concepts that we weren't really thinking about, maybe, at least Dartmouth as an institution wasn't thinking about, like embodied carbon. What does it mean that we have, whatever it is, $7 billion worth of infrastructure already on our campus that cost carbon to get here? How do you make a decision about whether you keep a building up or tear it down, knowing if you tear it down, you've got to pour new concrete, right? And there's an embodied carbon cost. There's a calculation that you have to do there if you're trying to reduce your carbon emissions overall. Transportation, obvious carbon links there. So just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that we're thinking about this in context. We're also thinking about our local impacts. These things, our water system on Dartmouth campus connects to Hanover's water system. When we have runoff going into a local stream, it impacts Hanover. So how are we thinking about that? How are we improving our resiliency? I said we can't let people freeze in their rooms. We can't have electrical supply interruptions. How are we thinking about becoming even more resilient as the climate becomes less predictable? It's really easy when you work on climate, when you think about climate every day, to get really, really depressed, right? Because I read the paper every morning. I read 3 papers every morning, and I always read the climate section, and it's a little bit hard, right? Because I see a lot of pictures that look like this. But I thought I'd share the image that gives me the most hope at the moment. It's this image. Do you know what this image is? So this is a carbon dioxide level in parts per million in the atmosphere over the last 1,000,000 years. So you can see, like, Earth is doing its thing, Earth is doing its thing, Earth is doing its thing, human, right? This is the famous graph. Like, this is not just regular variation. This is us, right? Climate change being caused by us. So why is this inspiring to me? Why is this my most hopeful image? I by the way, was thinking about this because I was co-teaching a class with Meredith Kelly and Elizabeth Wilson, and we asked the students to bring their most hopeful image, so I had to think of mine, and this is what I ended up with. So why is it my most hopeful image? Well, when I think about the animals on planet Earth, like dolphins who can swim underwater and echolocate, peregrine falcons who can dive at 200 miles an hour, I don't immediately think humans are the coolest animal. I have an 8-year-old daughter. When you ask her what animal do you want to be, she never says a human, right? We don't have talons, we have no venom, we're kind of lame. But we did this. We did this thing. We changed the atmosphere of a whole planet. We're these like kind of boring, mushy little shellless creatures, and we did this. Go us. And you know what's even more remarkable? We were not even trying. In fact, it was a side effect. So what would happen if we actually all tried? If we tried in the same direction, right? What is our big asset? We can't echolocate, but we have really stupidly large brains. So let's use them to do the opposite of this. That's why it's inspiring. The other thing that inspires me is living and working here. I love trying to solve this problem here. As I said, I think that this is the same problem everyone's dealing with, but I think we have, if we can solve it here, contributions we can make to the public discourse that will be impactful, kind of punching above our weight, beyond our size. And I think that's a huge golden opportunity. So I hope what this shows is that Dartmouth has been thinking really hard, that the people at Dartmouth, the individual humans, of which Dartmouth is made up, have been thinking really hard about how can we do this better. And I love that Judy started with the things that we abandoned, the places where we pivoted, because I actually think that represents something really important. Being able to say like, oh, we're gonna go, oh no, that is the wrong way, is actually, I think, a sign of being responsive, of caring about the science, and of being willing to pivot when we're headed the wrong direction. So I'm gonna stop there. Thank you all for your time, and I hope we'll have a good discussion and some questions. Any questions? Yeah.
What is the first area on campus that you're going to be working on?
Well, today we're drilling some test wells in the athletics district. And actually, if you guys want to see a well, on Thursday, I'm going to have coffee and donuts at the test wells on Chase Field. So athletic fields and open areas are great candidates for GeoExchange.
So that's Thursday at what time?
Thursday, I think 1 to 3. But how about I share it with Sustainable Hanover and you guys can post it as well? Is that useful? So athletic fields, open areas where we know we're not going to build. Those are great places to do GeoExchange because when you finish, you can put it back actually better than before. The green is a good location for GeoExchange. We drilled a test well there. It's right now looking like it's kind of far from our nearest heat plant or pump plant. So that's sort of causing some head scratching for us. I guess the short answer is we don't know exactly where we're going to start, but we're looking at open field areas and trying to understand, could we start with the athletics district and move things around in terms of practices so that it didn't disrupt athletics? Are there other open areas where we could put GeoExchange wells and then put things back? Yeah.
So I've seen you laying pipes for a long time. Are they under all the districts now?
Abby can probably answer this better than I can, but there is hot water to the west end. Most of the west end, I think, is running on hot water. There still is steam service to the dorms on the other side of the new west end buildings. There's hot water to most of the north end of campus. Where else is most of the hot water pipe laid?
We actually only have about 10% of our hot water distribution installed. So we have a lot more to do.
Yeah.
And we expect to be doing that in the coming years. It's going to take multiple years to get it all done.
Yeah.
I have a question about how Dartmouth thinks about building net new buildings as they expand their footprint. I'm a Tuck student. I know there's been talk about Tuck North, which would be building more infrastructure on the golf course.
Yeah.
How do you and the school think about building net new buildings and its impact on the environment, what we can do to be more sustainable?
That thinking is, I would say, one of the ways that we're talking a lot about that right now. We're talking about how can we drive decisions about embodied carbon into how we think about the cost of new buildings, for example. If you just look at capital cost, you're missing a whole part of the picture, carbon cost. So we've talked a lot about, is there some kind of internal price of carbon we could use that would help us evaluate whether we should build buildings or renovate buildings, use existing buildings. The conversation about space, like how much space do people need to do the things that they need to do, is always an ongoing conversation. I don't have a perfect answer for you, except to say that we're trying hard to think about what are mechanisms, processes, and structures we can put in place that push us to have a conversation every time we're going to build something new and say, do we actually need to build this new thing? If we're going to build this new thing, what are we taking offline, or how is this thing adding something we can't already do? But I think it's a great question, a really important one.
Before you go, could you just introduce yourself? People online would love to hear who's talking. If you could just introduce yourself, that would be great.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Jake Hampion, and I was wondering if the college is still open to other forms of heat storage. There are systems out there now that are servicing municipalities that are storing heat in sand, dry, and that are storing heat in in a combination of graphite and liquefied metal blocks.
Yeah.
These are technologies that allow you to, if you stored up front, if you stored at that temperature, you can store in sand, you can store up to 500 or 600 degrees centigrade.
Yeah.
That would allow you to not only store more heat in a smaller space, but it would also allow you to wean yourself off from steam more slowly because that's the kind of thermal load you can create steam with.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think there's anything we're not willing to consider. Right? I've read about the sand batteries and various kinds of heat storage. And part of what I like about moving to hot water and thinking about decentralizing our energy supply is that it enables us to deploy different technologies as they emerge and become scalable. So we're not kind of all of our eggs in one basket. But yes, totally open to it, happy to talk about it, happy to get connected with someone that can tell me about it.
It's pretty cool stuff.
It's pretty cool stuff,
It
yeah,
really is, pretty revolutionary.
yeah. I had someone approach me the other day about micro reactors, and I said the same thing. I did mention that it would be difficult to permit in the town of Hanover, but I remain open to the micro reactor. Yeah.
Tad Montgomery, Energy and Facilities Manager for the City of Lebanon. And first thing I want to say is that I am deeply inspired by the direction that Dartmouth has taken. It is a couple of orders of magnitude more beautiful and I think successful than the biomass project that was proposed. My question is, what are your growing edges on this project? What are the things that you're saying we don't know how to handle this yet, or we don't know how to solve this problem?
Well, there's always things. I mean, the balance between disruption and the speed at which we can move. That's a thing that's like a constant, like, oh, it's really hard to, I want to go as fast as humanly possible. Frank has to be like, hey, pipe down, pretty often, right? But I also know that we can't tear up every road, right? Or we can't move everyone out of every dorm, as much as I might like to sometimes. I think the maybe more interesting questions are around how will Dartmouth do our last 10% of carbon reduction? We don't know, right? We are basically going to commit to something that we don't know how to solve for yet. With the faith that between here and 2050, we are going to figure out the last, whatever it is, 15, 10% of our carbon emissions that are very difficult to solve for. That would be things like backup generators. Much more efficient to have a diesel backup generator than it is to have an equivalent number of batteries to run the campus. Prohibitively expensive right now to have batteries on that scale. So how are we going to deal with those kinds of carbon loads, right? The last 10%. What else? Equity. I think a lot about equity. Like Dartmouth should be doing this, and we have to figure out how to make this accessible to people, to institutions that don't have our kinds of resources. How do we do that? How do we include people in the process, but also keep hustling? Those kinds of questions I think are interesting. I don't know, are there any others? Frank and Abby work on this yet, Jack?
Well, I think this is a great point that you know, Dartmouth needs to be engaged with more than just the Hanover community. It needs to be engaged with the entire Upper Valley community and to share whatever knowledge we have and capabilities that we have to really ensure that the entire region, the area, can be included in this initiative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maybe I'll go here and then back to you, Jay. Yeah.
So you talked about the possibility of doing some solar farms, some large solar farms.
Yeah.
There are lots of small business people in this area who would perhaps like to be able to partner with you.
Yeah.
Are you thinking about ways to say, well, we're going to do this and we're going to do this on X location, and we could use partners that could buy a 1% or a 5% share of a solar farm?
We are thinking about that, and not just with solar. We're thinking about that kind of across the portfolio of our energy transition. And it's a thing I think we've thought about consistently, trying to figure out how to make it happen, how to engage people consistently over time. Before COVID, we kind of had a good thing going. We started to get some of the small businesses who are relatively big energy consumers together to chat. Then COVID hit and kind of that fell apart, and now I think we've got to bring it back together. I think Sustainable Hanover is a great partner in this, and we'd love to figure out how to collaborate with the Town of Hanover to bring people together, but we're always asking that question. When we think about hot water, one of the things that I'm thinking about is how could we start to have the conversation with people in town about how to decarbonize their houses with geo-exchange or using hot water? How do we think about Main Street? Snow removal in Main Street is a big pain in the neck for the Town of Hanover. Dartmouth can't become it's very difficult. We considered this a long time ago. It's very difficult for us to be a utility, to serve hot water to the town. But are there ways that we could be creative and think about, could we heat the sidewalk so that we don't have to shovel it in a small section of Main Street? Or is there stuff we can do that is beneficial to Dartmouth and the town? So it's a continued question. If you have ideas about how we can better collaborate, I'd love to hear them. Yeah.
I wanted to mention that downtown real estate has been backed up to the Dartmouth heating capacity for decades. And it might be worth including some of that load. If you're going to create a heating microgrid, try to include as much of that load as you can.
That's a great point. Yeah.
I've always considered that when you have a problem, the first thing you need to do is to be able to measure it. And what I don't see around here is really, really good measuring. And we're a teaching institution, and yet as a student, you can't discover anything about the building that you're in. And it shouldn't that be available on an API so that somebody can go in and grab the data and do the analysis for the class or something like, well, what affects the CO2 content of the air? How does that go up and down during the day? What affects, how much are we burning in kilowatt hours right this instant?
Yeah.
How much, convert that over into the BTUs and add in the steam and the hot water and everything for this building. And if you don't measure it, how do you engage?
We do measure it. We measure
for students to use in a classroom.
Yes, and we do that a lot. So there's lots of examples of students working with Dartmouth's real live energy data in the classroom to do that kind of work. What we don't have is a live interface where anybody can download that information. We've talked about this a lot. It is very difficult and expensive to build that interface on the front of our energy management system, and the number of users is very small. So what we do now is kind of bespoke data delivery. So Marcus spends a ton of time, Betsy Ricker spends a ton of time working with students who want to work on energy projects and giving them the data they need. So we have students who've worked on things like the Montgomery House energy retrofit, when they got all the data from Montgomery House. They came up with a plan to do an energy retrofit for Montgomery House. Several 8990 classes have done projects looking at all of Dartmouth's data. And students can look at building by building data if they wish. Yeah.
Well, just update.
Yeah.
We have a new energy management system where we are now just starting to implement APIs so that students can directly download energy use data. So it is happening.
I've been fortunate enough to see some of the kind of the back end of the system that Abby's describing. I think it's going to do a lot of the things you've just described. It's going to take us from a, version 1.0 to a very new, advanced and modern set of systems for collecting energy data on our buildings and all of our systems. And Abby's team is working very hard to do that.
We call it our Smart Campus Initiative.
It's already being measured, it's needing to be communicated. Any questions from online?
No. one that I've solved for, but none that are outstanding.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Bill Young, and I'm a citizen of the town and on a bike committee and an Appalachian Trail committee and a few other things. You were talking about, Bill's talking about observational data. There's a student, Javier Lopez, who's from Texas, who is taking a course on observation of the wilderness or observation of nature, taught by one of your faculty members, it's Christina Smith. And he has been observing Ockham Pond this year. So going from the digital objective data, he's just been observing Ockham Pond for a full term or a full year, I'm not quite sure how, at a meeting at Ockham Pond this morning. And one of the things that he observed, in our neighborhood observed, is that this is the earliest ice out. The earliest ice out on Ockham Pond, we think, since 1911. 1911 was March the 25th, I think. It was out on March the 7th. We determine ice out is when one of our neighbors, Bruce Atwood, can swim from the north end to the south end through ice-free water. Anyway, that's the decision. But anyway, that was fascinating. It's a very, very Dartmouthy kind of thing to be observing a specific place and learning all about where the deer were crossing, where the ice came in and came out. So that's the one. What you're pointing out is very real. Two other quick things. You're phenomenal at this presentation stuff. So hands off for figuring out how to make PowerPoints or whatever you're using work. The images are fun, thermos and everything else kind of are understandable. And finally, our late neighbor, Peter Fahey, would be grateful. He's like the Lorax. The trees have no voice since Peter died a year or two ago, but he's been a champion of some of the pivots that you've talked about, and probably a pain in the butt for some of the time with the pivots away from things, but in a good way. And so Peter would be very happy to hear where you're headed at this time. So thanks for the presentation.
Hear that. Thank you very much, Bill. Yeah.
Mary Ann Cadwallader again. Thinking about changing hearts and minds. How do you get, have you been thinking about how to get students to be more conscious of lights, heat, waste, and have those campaigns been successful? What are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I would say that students right now are super, super concerned about climate change in general. The average student is worried about climate change, which actually is a pretty big difference than when I started 10 years ago. They're stressed about it, but they don't necessarily know what to do. And I think we have a couple students online, so they can pipe up if they want to offer any thoughts. But I think one of the challenges we face as we ask students to change their behavior is that most of the energy consumption at Dartmouth is not stuff they can control. So the impacts, the stuff that they can do, turning off the light switch in their dorm room, for example, is not a very big energy impact. It's not to say they shouldn't do it, but it's not a very big energy impact. When I first came, we looked at doing dorm energy competitions and that kind of thing. We found that it was very difficult to do because not only could students not control very much, but it was very difficult to give them feedback at a granular enough scale that they could see that they were having an impact. So in order to do that, you would have to have data at a room by room level, for example. We have data on the building, but not on a room by room level. So if you have an dorm energy competition, what you typically have is 10 students who are doing everything they possibly can to reduce energy, 20 students who are doing a teeny bit, and 10 students who are doing nothing, right? And it was very difficult to see the downward tick in the building's energy use, and people got discouraged. What we have found is that students who are doing projects where they can see that Dartmouth's direction is changing and that they are having an impact on that, those students feel like they're making a difference. So whether that's green to go and reducing disposal of 13,000 clamshells a day, or whether that's GRACE mapping the subsurface landscape so that we can do a better job drilling geoexchange boreholes, or whether that's students in 8990 presenting their findings to a group of senior decision makers at Dartmouth and having those decision makers ask questions where the students can see they've actually maybe tilted the direction, right? Those things capture students. So we are talking about personal behavior change, but we're also talking about this whole system needs to change and you can become invested in that. That answer your question? Yeah.
I think Is there a question online first?
Yeah, there was a question from Phil Bush, who is from West Lebanon, he's class of 69 and on Sustainable Lebanon. And he was just interested to hear about our connection with alumni.
It's a great question.
The sustainability work specifically.
Yeah, so alumni obviously are a huge part of Dartmouth's impact in the world, of our connection to the world, et cetera. There's a lot of alumni passion and engagement around climate. There is a new alumni group that has formed a recognized, I can't remember what it's called.
Special interest group?
Yes, SIG, Special Interest Group. So they are now a recognized alumni group of Dartmouth College, called something like the Dartmouth Alumni for Climate Leadership. So you can join that group. And as a SIG, we're going to do regular events with them to update the alumni community that way. There's also the Dartmouth Alumni for Climate Action, which is one of the ancestors of that SIG, and they are continuing to function as a more ad hoc alumni conversation on climate. So those are two ways to get engaged. I'm speaking at alumni events during reunions. You can host a climate-related event during your reunion if you want. That's a great way to get engaged. I'd gladly come speak to reunion groups. I did that last year for 2 classes and would be glad to do it more. So those are some of the ways that alumni can get involved. And we also have alums constantly giving us feedback. I mean, the biomass plan, we heard from alums what they thought about biomass. And we hear from alums all the time. Yeah.
Hi, Rosie. I'm Stan Koloff. Like my wife, I live in Hanover. And I have a somewhat related question to the one that Phil just asked. You made a point earlier about when you're trying to retrofit buildings or build buildings that are energy efficient. In the world of fundraising, a wall doesn't have what we call marquee value.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the appetite for financial support amongst alumni for some of these bigger projects? Are people willing to commit to some of these expensive projects as we look to the future?
Well, I mean, the Irving building is an example where they committed to making that building super energy efficient, and it was part of the plan. And I think in general, there's a nascent but growing passion from alums who are interested in being significant donors related to sustainability. And I think there's more and more understanding of the fact that things like walls are really important and that building a tight envelope is worth investing in. Some of that is also that Dartmouth is doing a good job of saying we want to build buildings that we're going to be able to manage. We want your building to look great in 25 or 50 years and to function well. So we need to build a great building that's going to last and not one that's going to tie Dartmouth to an expensive operating cost over time. That I think is resonant. But I think there's more and more enthusiasm from alums and donors on this topic. I can tell you that when I arrived, for some weird reason that I don't understand, I started in October and I spoke to the Board of Trustees in November, even though I didn't know anything about anything. One of the things I remember from that first meeting is several trustees really pushing back and saying, we need to be doing projects that have a 2.5-year payback. Then there was a discussion among the trustees, well, it's 5 years, maybe it's better than 5 years, 2.5 years. Anyone who works on sustainability knows those kinds of returns are way too short to really work on climate. And Dartmouth owns and operates our own infrastructure, and we're building buildings with a plan not to renovate them again for 50 years, right? If that's the case, we need to be thinking of 50-year paybacks, not 2.5-year paybacks. The difference between how the Board of Trustees is thinking now, where climate is a real risk in their own business environment, and then is a total sea change. They're asking really good hard questions about managing Dartmouth's long-term resiliency, about managing for risk. So I think that's where I see that change is starting to happen. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Mikey Yablon, I'm a Tuck student. Is there, when you guys think about your overall carbon impact for the school, do you guys take into account food, and jumping off that, how we can reduce food waste or use food or consume our food more responsibly?
It's a great question. So right now, Dartmouth is measuring and accounting for our scope 1 and 2 emissions, but there are the emissions that we generate in our heating and cooling and in our purchased electricity. We are beginning to calculate our scope 3 emissions, of which food is one. We know our scope 3 emissions, which are our indirect emissions. So those are, if I fly to a conference, I'm not responsible for the whole plane, but Dartmouth is responsible for my seat on the plane, right? Or the food tonight, right? Or the carbon cost of the chairs in Dartmouth classrooms, right? That we buy, but they have a carbon cost. We're starting to wrap our arms around calculating our scope 3 emissions and thinking about how to reduce our scope 3 emissions. Food waste is actually something we're already pushing. Dining services is pushing hard on it because it aligns with reducing costs, right?
Yeah.
It's like efficiency. But we are starting to think about how are we going to measure and how are we going to account for our scope 3 emissions and how are we going to change those over time. We have had an interesting discussion about choice and how, like, for example, you could say, okay, red meat of a certain type is super high in carbon emissions, therefore we're just going to stop offering it. Or you could say, we're going to reduce the portion size on red meat, and if you want to eat more of it, you have to go back and get more than one portion, right? So we're starting to have conversations about that kind of thing. What are the strategies that we're going to use to mitigate scope 3 emissions? The answer is we're beginning.
Yeah, no, that's great, thank you.
Yeah, Jay.
I wanted to know if there was still any consideration for interim solutions that would drop your carbon footprint more immediately, the way, for example, the hospital has done when they went to CNG instead of fuel oil. And the second part of my question is, have you had any discussions about integrating with the HMC in terms of including as part of a heating district or a microgrid?
We have had discussions with DHMC over the years, iterative discussions over time. So that's the answer to the second part of your question. I think at this point, we are not considering short-term transitions in our combustion strategy that require major infrastructural investments. So for example, if we were to switch to CNG, that would be an expensive short-term switch.
But if it had been done in 2016, when it was last discussed,
right?
Think about the number of gallons that it would have saved.
Sure. I also think we wouldn't be having the discussion we're having now. We would keep doing what we're doing, like the hospital is. So there's a trade-off there. Also, we didn't do it, right? So as much as I would like to change a lot of things about 2016, I can't. So I'm not actually suggesting that I would have, I don't think we should have gone to CNG or LNG, because I think my study of places that have used it as a bridge fuel, they almost never make the transition after that.
Okay.
Because the sunk cost is just too great. And that makes a lot of sense economically, and you're already in a lower carbon category, so you just stick with what you got. And that would have been my fear.
Mm-hmm.
That was my fear at the time.
Yeah. The sunk cost for CNG for Dartmouth wasn't that high at the time.
Well, we can take this offline, because probably
Yeah.
most people aren't as excited about that conversation as Jay and I might be, but we can talk about it.
Yeah.
It was significant because of where our plant is and some of the technicalities of our
Yeah.
plant, et cetera. Blast radius, including Frank's office, all that kind of issue. Frank wasn't concerned about that, but I was very concerned about Frank being in the blast radius. Any other questions?
So
Jack
I'd
in the
like
back
to
and then
comment
you,
about curricular issues that might be of interest to the community, because I think you've mentioned Engines 8990, which people might not know about.
Yeah.
And that's the capstone project for Bachelor of Engineering students. It's a 2-term project that teams of students take on, where they address real-life projects that come from clients. And anybody can propose a project.
Doesn't necessarily get chosen, but you
No,
can
it
propose
doesn't necessarily get chosen.
I
But through
propose
the
many.
Cook Design Center at the engineering school, you can propose projects to these teams of really intelligent, talented, and hardworking students to undertake a problem that you might think is significant. Also at the Tuck School, there are first-year projects, which are also team projects that address problems or issues for real-life clients. There's also the Rivers Energy Center, where they have really talented energy fellows who are really interested in all kinds of issues associated with climate. So I would encourage members of the community to get engaged with those kinds of things. And then in terms of, kind of on the ground education, I can attest personally that at President Bylock's inauguration picnic, Rosie was there instructing us all, and Marcus, how to separate our trash into recyclables, compostables, and trash. And,
We had no trash at that. We just had recyclables and compostables.
And we're all just recyclables and compostables because there was no trash at President Bylock's inauguration picnic. So, I think that there's a lot of really good stuff going on. I also want to kudos to Frank and Abby and Dave Foster, who's now retired from, right?
Very much so.
From operations and management at the college, and they've done an amazing job to help to transform college operations, especially in terms of energy management and tracking information and really, making it possible for us to know what we're doing on campus, which before they got involved, there were people going out with notebooks, reading steam meters and condensation meters in every building and trying to put together this data. And, these guys really brought us into the 21st century.
And that is not an easy job because Dartmouth's infrastructure is sort of like a geological sedimentary situation where there's a layer from every era. And, my experience in sitting in design meetings or renovation meetings is one Dartmouth building. Every single one is a different thing. So getting it all to a place where we can see it is actually doesn't seem like it would be that hard.
Critical.
It's actually very difficult.
Really, really important.
Yeah. Do you want to
Well,
take us out with a bang?
You had mentioned a couple of times in your remarks that under your breath, kind of, you weren't sure if Dartmouth, or if the town of Hanover would allow something.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering if there's something specific in mind that you're thinking about, and if there is a way for the town, we have changed some zoning
Yeah.
laws to accommodate more solar, so that
Yeah.
it's more readily, and
Yeah.
have you thought about that? in
Yeah, and I
terms of-
actually think I should be careful about how I say that. I was specifically, in my brain, I was thinking about a conversation I had the other day with an alum who's really into micro nuclear, and I just was like, I just can't see how we're gonna put that in Hanover.
Oh.
But I actually think that there's been a great evolution in the town's thinking, the town's willingness to be collaborative and to think like, how are we gonna get this decarbonization done? And I think we're coming back or closer to a sort of great working relationship where we're able to have an open dialogue about here's what Dartmouth is trying to accomplish, and then we can kind of work on this together and not start off with a fully baked plan, but actually collaborate together. So I think the town has been wonderful about the adjustments to zoning that have allowed solar or even, housing that is denser or that kind of thing. I think that's critically important. So I think the town has been a great partner, and I should stop saying anything under my breath, but I was sort of, in my head, I was thinking about this conversation I had with an alum and micronuclear. So, which I don't think we allow yet in Hanover, although I'm not sure. But I appreciate very much that the effort the town has put into making it possible for us to make this transition, because that's critical.
I think there are going to be more opportunities over the coming years as we, propose specific things like a geothermal well field or a, geothermal heat pump plant or, other thermal storage, other things that I think it'll be an ongoing thing that hopefully we can communicate with Sustainable Hanover and get some support to help, sell those ideas to the community that, may not be, maybe a little difficult.
Yeah, I think some of these things are going to be painful, loud, inconvenient, or whatever in the short run. Like building a geo-exchange bore field is like a loud, muddy thing, ugly thing to look at. And we're gonna have to live through some amount of that kind of disturbance together. So I think it's gonna be remembering that like, we're doing this. It's sort of like we're doing this really hard workout because we want to get to the fitness goal, right? And that's what we're going to have to go through a little bit over the next couple of years. You're gonna be driving to someplace you always go, and the road is going to be closed for 2 weeks or something because we're ripping it up to put pipe underneath it. We're going to try to do our best to have everybody know why we're doing this in advance. And if you go out to the well field tomorrow, you'll see that we made a whole bunch of signs to say like, this isn't a water well, this is decarbonization. We're trying to figure out what's under the ground so we can figure out if this is a suitable place to put geo-exchange wells. And I feel like that ongoing communication, that like this point of inconvenience or temporary pain is leading to a better place where we can, we hope, decommission that big smokestack that you referred to, Judy, in the middle of town. Yeah.
I just wanted to say I'm really encouraged that Dartmouth's really going to start taking some of the big steps.
Thanks.
It's long overdue, and I think it's really good to actually start to get boots on the ground and get some of them done. We're talking about the geothermal step, which is a big and long one. But the building that's right across the street did geothermal over a decade ago.
Yeah.
And hopefully we learned from that. And when we integrate it, we're going to be doing a closed system, not a pump and dump, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
exactly.
Learning how to make these steps is really critical, and I'm glad that we're finally actually doing it.
Me too.
Yeah.
Very glad. And it is in no small part to all of your efforts. Yeah.
It seems to me that one of the biggest things you can do is to really have a lot of communications.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hoping there's some way that you develop that pertains to the whole town, so they can be in step with you and appreciate things rather than all of a sudden something happens and they go, what?
Yeah.
You're just, as you bring people along, because you have figured out some way to keep announcing that these things are going on.
Yeah.
I think it's really important for you to do that.
Thank you. That's a great feedback. And if people have ideas about how we can do that more effectively, I think one of the things that we've learned is that we have to do it in a variety of ways, iteratively, often, kind of just keep going. So, an example of that's local to Dartmouth is we have an announcement system. Every day you get a Vox daily announcement. And one thing you could do is say like, oh, we'll just put an announcement in Vox Daily and then everyone will know. We know that's inadequate, right? Because even though we all might skim Vox Daily every day, we need to hear about something from, I don't know, for me, maybe it's 4 different ways before it sinks through my thick skull, right? So I actually need to hear about it in Vox Daily, and then I need to see a poster about it, and I need Marcus to tell me about it when we're getting coffee, and then, so we're trying to think about what are all the ways we can use formal and informal communication channels to have people come across this information a lot, so that it's not like we could put a announcement in the Valley News every time we're going to do something, and we know only 10% of people would see it, right? So we got to get to 90% or something like that. So if you have ideas or thoughts about how we can do a better job of that kind of iterative, ongoing communication, it's Marcus going to Sustainable Hanover, it's me going to Upper Valley Climate Adaptation Working Group, it's having conversations like this one. Maybe we do this more, over the course of the next couple of years while we're doing this. So if you have ideas, please share them because we'd really love to know.
Thank you, Rosie.
Thank you all very much.